Imagine a ruler so feared that even his own allies whispered his name in secret. An emperor who, from within an isolated island, transformed the greatest empire on earth into a theater of paranoia, terror, and unimaginable perversion. That man was Tiberius Caesar Augustus, the second emperor of Rome. And the stories about him are so disturbing that even today, historians debate whether they truly happened, or if the truth might have been even worse. In the year 14 AD, when he took the throne after Augustus's death, Rome breathed a sigh of relief. Here was an experienced, disciplined general with victories in the north of the empire and a reputation as a competent administrator. In the eyes of the people, Tiberius was the ideal successor to maintain the stability of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But there were hidden cracks: a forced marriage, the loss of his beloved brother, and personal tragedies opened deep wounds. Wounds that, over time, would transform into something much darker. For more than a decade, Tiberius governed reasonably. He avoided wars, controlled spending, and maintained Augustus's policies. But as the years passed, his bitterness grew. The final blow came in 23 AD, when his son Drusus died under suspicious circumstances. From that moment on, the man who had once commanded legions began to withdraw from Rome and to retreat within himself. In 26 AD, Tiberius made the decision that would seal his reputation. He abandoned Rome and exiled himself to the island of Capri. Officially, he was seeking rest. In practice, he was building a private kingdom of fear and excess. 12 villas scattered across the island served as the stage for parties, intrigues, and rituals that would make even the Romans most accustomed to luxury shrink in horror. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Senate received only letters, some with execution orders, others with deadly silence. And those who returned from Capri rarely spoke of what they had seen. Because what really happened within those walls? The stories are so grotesque that even ancient historians wrote about them with disgust and disbelief. But if they are true, then Tiberius was not just a cruel emperor. He became something far worse. Capri, with its majestic cliffs and crystal-clear waters, seemed like a paradise. But for those who were taken there, the island became an inferno. Tiberius built 12 villas at strategic points, each luxurious, each hiding secrets that even the servants dared not repeat aloud. Rome received only rumors, but the few who returned spoke of sinister banquets and games that no decent Roman would dare to imagine. Suetonius, writing decades later, described scenes too disturbing even for Roman standards. According to him, young people were brought in to entertain the emperor in private spectacles, while the villa walls were covered with erotic paintings imported from the East. Tacitus, more restrained but equally indignant, reported that Capri had transformed into a court of fear, where cruelty was mixed with a morbid hedonism. Whether all of this was political exaggeration or the naked truth, no one can say for sure. But the mere fact that the Romans believed these stories shows how deeply Tiberius's name was plunged into terror. And what's most unsettling, Tiberius did not act alone. Ambitious members of the elite began to compete for his attention, offering unthinkable gifts. Even members of their own families, if it meant advancement. An entire empire began to revolve around satisfying the whims of a single man. It was a system of corruption where the currency was not gold, but human flesh. And refusing to participate was not an option. The charge of treason could fall upon anyone at any moment. Meanwhile, in the capital, a climate of paranoia suffocated society. Conversations disappeared from dinner parties, writers burned their own texts, and even children were taught to monitor what they said in their sleep, because one wrong whisper could mean the death of the entire family. Rome still seemed to function. The legions guarded the borders, taxes were collected, and the temples remained standing. But behind this facade, something deeper was corroding, and Tiberius, isolated on his island, seemed to feed on this fear. The older he got, the more he gave in to paranoia and cruelty. A man who once led armies now ruled through blood-stained letters, and his mind, consumed by delusions and suspicions, was about to transform the Senate itself into a death machine. While Tiberius was hiding in Capri, Rome was not without a government. But the orders did not come from public speeches or Senate decrees. They arrived on scraps of parchment, cold letters sealed with the imperial seal. Some announced executions, others said nothing, and that silence was often even more deadly. A misinterpreted gesture, a joke told in confidence, even an expression of boredom in the presence of the emperor's statue. Any detail could be reported as treason. It was in this climate that a new class of parasites emerged, the informers, professional denouncers who got rich by pointing out suspects. And since the accused rarely survived, their assets were confiscated, divided between the state and the accuser. The system rewarded lies. The more elaborate the accusation, the greater the chance of getting rich. And in a short time, all of Rome turned into a network of spies. Friends, neighbors, even family members. Anyone could be an informer. The Senate, once the proud guardian of the Republic, was reduced to a pathetic theater of submission. Senators competed to propose new honors for the emperor, each trying to show more loyalty than the next. Some even voted for the death of colleagues just to save their own skin. There were those who preferred suicide, believing that at least their family would survive. But not even the dead were safe. Tiberius ordered posthumous trials, confiscating inheritances, and destroying the names he despised. For Tiberius, the pain of others transformed into entertainment. Parents were forced to watch the execution of their children. Men received a pardon only to be executed days later, when they already believed they were safe. It was a psychological game, a cruel experiment in how to break the human spirit. Rome was no longer governed by laws. It was governed by the whims of a man isolated on his island. And if Capri had already become a nightmare, what came next would show the extent to which Tiberius's mind had become distorted. Because his paranoia, his old age, and his cruelty were about to reach their peak, and the entire empire would feel the tremors. Tiberius was no longer the vigorous general who crossed rivers and forests in Germania. At 70, his body was stooped, his face marked by illnesses and strange treatments. Scars, wounds, and patches concealed the passage of time. He became almost unrecognizable, a shadow of the man he had been, but his mind still seethed with paranoia and cruelty. Every gust of wind, every shadow in the corridors of Capri could be, in his eyes, a conspiracy. Even those who had helped sustain his reign of terror were not safe. Senators, prefects, and even generals of the Praetorian Guard fell one by one. Some were poisoned, others publicly humiliated before disappearing. Tiberius watched it all with cruel pleasure, testing loyalties and observing the limits of obedience and fear. Even his old ally, Sejanus, who had dominated power in Rome during the emperor's exile, ended up a victim of his own ambition, executed after a series of intrigues and accusations. The old emperor developed an almost supernatural obsession with death. He consulted astrologers daily, interpreting every dream and every movement of birds as omens. Any prediction that displeased him resulted in execution. Food was tested on prisoners before it reached him. Guards watched guards, and every visitor to Capri could be a sentence disguised as friendship. The isolation that once offered freedom now imprisoned him in a mind that was consuming itself. Rome continued to breathe, but with difficulty. The administration functioned by inertia. Borders were maintained, tributes collected, but the spirit of a vibrant empire was dead. The Senate had lost all autonomy. Citizens lived in silence and terror, and informers prospered. The law, justice, and Roman custom, everything was transformed into an instrument of fear. And Capri? It had become not just the emperor's sanctuary, but a symbol of corrupted absolute power, where any human logic became irrelevant in the face of Tiberius's whims. In 37 AD, at the age of 77, Tiberius died. History records his death as natural, but rumors persisted. Was he assassinated by those he feared? Did he die of fear or of betrayal? The empire sighed. Rome breathed again. But the legacy of horror and distrust would remain for decades, shaping the way Romans and history would remember his name. Tiberius teaches us something disturbing. When absolute power meets a mind inclined to cruelty, the result can be monstrous. And even after centuries, the shadow of Capri continues to provoke us. To what extent can ambition, loneliness, and fear corrupt the human soul? Tiberius Caesar Augustus died in 37 AD, but the shadow of his reign persisted for centuries. Rome survived, the empire continued, but the moral and psychological fabric of Roman society was never the same. He showed that absolute power, when combined with paranoia, desire, and isolation, can transform respected leaders into figures of absolute terror. The stories of Capri crossed generations. Parents scared their children with the emperor's name. Senators, writers, and citizens learned to live in constant vigilance. Distrust became the norm, and fear shaped politics, culture, and even family life. The Senate, which once debated openly, now became a stage for silent intrigues. Justice, an instrument of order, became a weapon of oppression. And the informers prospered, creating a network of terror that would influence later rulers. For modern historians and psychologists, Tiberius is a dark study of how loneliness, personal tragedy, and unrestrained power can corrupt the mind. Disorders like paranoia and sadism seem evident, but the greater lesson is not just in the illness, it's in the opportunity that power gave him to act without limits. What differentiates Tiberius from other tyrants is the meticulousness of his terror. He did not just destroy physically, he corroded the trust, morality, and psyche of an entire society. Tacitus, Suetonius, and other historians immortalized Capri as the symbol of imperial depravity. Some exaggerated, others tried to be precise. But the consensus remains. Tiberius transformed his life into a historical warning. He became the archetype of the ruler who, isolated and disconnected from humanity, allows fear and cruelty to define every decision. The legacy of Tiberius is more than terror and perversion. It is a lesson about power, loneliness, and the fragility of human morality. When we let ambition, paranoia, and isolation dominate, even the most disciplined mind can become an instrument of destruction. And Capri, with its cliffs and silent villas, remains as the somber monument of a man who transformed glory into horror, reminding us that history is not just made of victories, but also of eternal warnings. In the last years of his life, Tiberius was no longer the disciplined general who had conquered the north of the empire. His aged and weakened body grotesquely reflected the corruption of his mind. Illnesses, wounds, and the weight of age transformed his face, but the cruelty only grew. Every decision was permeated by extreme paranoia. Every letter sent to Rome carried threats and execution orders. Even those who had been faithful and complicit were not safe. Sejanus and other ministers who helped feed the reign of terror were eliminated, often in a meticulous and cruel manner. Tiberius seemed to test the loyalty of his own blood, creating an endless cycle of suspicion, fear, and punishment. The island of Capri became a psychological prison, not only for visitors, but for the emperor himself, consumed by the suspicion of betrayal in every shadow. The emperor, now obsessed with his mortality, daily consulted astrologers and soothsayers, changing decisions based on omens. He fed on rumors of conspiracies and sought signs of betrayal in every word. Guards, letters, messengers, all were evaluated with an almost maniacal distrust. Absolute power had transformed into a self-destructive addiction. While Capri was a stage for delusions and excesses, Rome continued under the yoke of an absent man. The executions, confiscations, and denunciations continued, reminding everyone that the emperor's fear spread like an invisible shadow, touching every corner of the empire. Tiberius's psychological game was so devastating that the very order of the state seemed to depend on his capricious will. In 37 AD, Tiberius died of natural causes, according to accounts, but not without rumors of assassination or deception circulating. Some claimed he was suffocated by those close to him, others that he died alone, in his isolation, consumed by his own paranoia. The truth may never be known. But his death did not erase the horror he left behind. Capri, Rome, and the empire itself would forever bear the mark of his reign. What remains for us is to ask, was Tiberius a monster born of tragic circumstances and absolute power? Or was it pure evil just waiting for the opportunity to reveal itself? His legacy is an eternal warning. Power without limits and absolute isolation can transform even the most respected men into figures of absolute terror. Tiberius Caesar Augustus died, but his impact on the Roman Empire continued long beyond his life. Rome had survived wars and political intrigues, but its moral and social fabric was deeply corroded. Fear had taken root in every city, every family, every ruling elite. Mutual trust had evaporated, and the culture of denunciation and paranoia that flourished under his rule left marks that would last for decades. Suetonius and Tacitus wrote their works with indignation and repulsion, but also with an almost journalistic eye. They recorded what they saw and heard, creating accounts that would shock even Roman standards. Some modern scholars question whether all the accounts were accurate or exaggerated for political reasons. Still, the consistency and volume of the accusations suggest that Tiberius was not just a cruel ruler, but someone whose mind had been shaped for total tyranny. The case of Tiberius is a timeless warning. When power finds no limits and isolation feeds paranoia, even competent leaders can become monsters. Personal tragedies, the constant fear of conspiracy, and the absence of oversight transformed the emperor into a terrifying figure. The man who was once respected as a general now symbolized the extreme abuse of authority. Contemporary psychologists might diagnose a combination of disorders: paranoia, sadism, and an obsession with absolute control. But even without modern labels, it is clear that the moral and psychological corruption of a leader does not just affect his life, but an entire society. The entire empire, from the streets of Rome to the isolated islands of Capri, felt the weight of Tiberius's distorted mind. The name of Tiberius became synonymous with silent terror, unlimited power, and absolute corruption. His reign reminds us that institutions must resist tyranny, that ethical vigilance is essential, and that even the most respected men can succumb to their own demons. While the ruins of Capri and the parchments of Rome remain, the observer is left with a disturbing question. Was the monster in the circumstances, or always within him? The story of Tiberius is, above all, a dark tale of what happens when ambition, loneliness, and absolute power meet. Tiberius passed away on March 16th, 37 AD, at the age of 77, alone and surrounded by the silence of his own fears. Some accounts suggest that his death was hastened by the new Praetorian prefect, Macro, while others claim he succumbed naturally. In any case, the emperor who had lived in constant terror finally faced death alone, abandoned even by his own perversions. When the news reached Rome, the people exploded in celebration. "To the Tiber with Tiberius!" they shouted in the streets, demanding that his body be thrown into the river like a common criminal. The Senate, finally free from the fear that had dominated its decisions for decades, initially refused to grant him the deification that Augustus had received. Only the intervention of Caligula allowed Tiberius to receive the funeral rites of an emperor, but the ceremony lacked the genuine mourning that had marked the death of his predecessor. Tiberius's reign left deep scars on the Roman psyche. Citizens learned in a painful way that the emperor could be a monster capable of transforming the administrative machine into an instrument of terror. The notion that the Principate, conceived by Augustus to bring stability, could produce perverse rulers became a permanent fear. The Senate never recovered its dignity or independence, having been crushed by fear and the systematic use of treason trials, informants, and false accusations. For the population, the experience created a culture of survival. Romans learned the art of not exposing themselves, of interpreting signs of imperial displeasure, and of protecting their families at the cost of their own morality. An entire generation grew up trained to hide their thoughts, distrust colleagues, and silence any criticism. The psychological consequences lasted for decades, profoundly affecting how society related to power. The direct victims of the regime, children, senators, families, were deprived of justice. Many disappeared without a trace, while others had their lives destroyed by systematic abuse, torture, and humiliation. The villas of Capri remained empty for years, associated with curses and perversion, while the torture chambers in Rome remained famous, symbols of an institutionalized terror. The human suffering, though partially invisible in historical records, is incalculable, as each statistic represents a life interrupted or marked by cruelty. The role of the accomplices cannot be underestimated. Tiberius relied on prosecutors, guards, informants, and courtiers, who benefited from the suffering of others. Some acted out of fear, others out of greed, transforming evil into an organized, normalized, and sustainable operation. This system of cooperation in crime shows how corruption and perversion spread, affecting the entire social, political, and economic structure. Despite the horror, the Roman administrative machine continued to function. Trade proceeded, taxes were collected, and infrastructure was maintained. This disconnect between political oppression and economic continuity shows that large and complex systems can operate even under monstrous leadership. At the same time, it reveals a disquieting degree of complicity. Officials, merchants, and governors continued their routines while horrors occurred all around them. Tiberius is almost unique in history for merging administrative competence with personal depravity. Comparisons with other tyrants, Nero, Caligula, show that few exploited the state to satisfy private desires in such a systematic way. The emperor's reign called into question the trust in rulers and Roman morality itself. Thinkers, philosophers, and common citizens questioned divine justice, virtue, and ethics, paving the way for new religious and spiritual movements that offered hope and justice beyond this world. Tiberius's death brought immediate relief, but it did not solve the structural problems that allowed for his tyranny. The Principate system remained vulnerable, ready to produce both monsters and competent rulers. The memory of the terror, however, hardened Roman society, teaching it that absolute power without checks could corrupt any institution. Even today, the story of Tiberius serves as a warning. Evil prospers not just from the nature of one man, but from the complicity of many. Every accomplice, guards, senators, prosecutors, contributed to turning personal perversion into state policy. The lesson is clear: vigilance is necessary. The law must protect everyone, and the memory of past horrors must be kept alive, so that civilization never repeats the mistakes of the past. Tiberius died hated and alone. His empire survived, but the mark of his terror remained. Between human wickedness and the resilience of the spirit, we find the most important lesson. Evil can flourish, but memory and resistance can endure forever.